Chapter 16. As the night came again, Simon found himself climbing the long stairway to the rooftop once more. He found Taya already there, sitting in one of the thrones and watching the activities of the city at night. The marketplace was empty of vendors selling goods, and now it was filled with people who sold their wares under the cover of darkness. Simon had asked Taya and Ra about this. He had wondered why, when they ruled, they had let the business continue at night. Ra had explained that when they first began their rule, they had outlawed all these activities that revolved around human vices. They had found the population had become unruly and began to rebel against them. They had thought that people would want to live in a peaceful place where women and children felt safe to walk down the street at night. Instead, they found interrupting this part of their lives made them angry. Some, they were sure, would have appreciated it, but most did not. So the slavery and prostitution were allowed to continue, as were the drinking and fighting. Somehow the humans had become convinced it would be abnormal not to have these things. Simon sat down next to her and waited patiently. "I saw you practice your swords with your father today. You're quite skilled, but your father could have easily beaten you," she said, not yet looking at him. "My father has been teaching me since I could walk. He, however, will always be better than me. He was a soldier, and so his skills come from actually defending his own life. Mine, I'm sorry to say, have never been in real danger," Simon answered, knowing his father and uncle both would always have the advantage over him. Now he turned to you. Now he turned to her. "What about your father?" She was thrown off by the question and had to take a minute to regain her composure. She hadn't let his memory enter her mind in so long, it took a moment to remember him. "He was a trapper. He would sell his pelts for money, and he farmed what little land we had. He never sold anything he farmed, though. It was just enough for our small family to live," she answered. She then remembered the easy way he smiled and how his eyes would crinkle around the edges when he did. He was always smiling at her mother, and she knew they must have been madly in love to always be so happy together. She could picture her mother cooking over a small fire and laughing with him as they talked, or the way he would hold her in his arms and make her come look at the moon with him when it was full. They would talk in low tones at night, and she always wondered what they spoke of on those nights. That knowledge would be lost to time now. She would never know the true hearts of her parents. She had died too young to get to know them as if she would have if they had grown into a woman and a mother herself. She would never know the honor of caring for them in their old age as they cared for her as a child. She had robbed her entire family of ever knowing what life would have held. Simon could see the emotions of the memory crossing Taya's face. "It wasn't your fault," he said to her. "What wasn't my fault?" she asked, being pulled from her memories by the sound of his voice. "What happened to you and your family," he told her. "About that you are wrong. There was no one but myself to blame," she answered bitterly and sat up a little straighter, realizing she was showing emotion. "No, I saw you, Taya. You were an innocent young girl who could never have known the prince's true intentions. Nor could you have known how treacherous he would be. What happened to you was the same thing that happened to Hannah. Do you think any of us would blame her for what happened with Derek? She was gentle and had a loving heart. Trusting is not a crime, but betrayal should be. You couldn't have known what would happen to your family. Even if your father had told you what men were capable of, he couldn't have prepared you for what happened that night," Simon told her. "Your family was not killed by your sister's actions, though. Mine was," Taya said logically. "That's exactly what they had planned for us, though. If you had not shown up that morning, we all would have fought for our own lives. Your family, on the other hand, had no chance in that situation. They made sure to kill your father first, and none of you stood a chance after that. Stop blaming that young girl. We both saw she could never have known the outcome. You punish her even now for something that wasn't her fault," he told her, desperately hoping she would see the reasoning of what he had said. Taya considered his words carefully. It would be nice to allow herself the memories of her family. She had always felt alone and would love to close her eyes and see them all again on occasion. She could not do that because she carried this guilt with her. Instead, she tucked them all away safely. She would bear the weight of this guilt and shield their memories from any more pain. Could it be that Simon was right, and she could have never known what would happen. She had spent centuries chastising herself over the things she had overlooked. She had always known if she had been smarter, it never would have happened. She looked at Simon and wondered what had even made her take him there to that time in the first place. She had thought he must understand the treachery of man, but now she realized it was something different. She had wanted him to see what she had done. She had wanted him to know exactly what kind of monster she was. But instead, he had seen something else. He had seen the girl she had been and stood next to the woman she had become, offering kindness. She felt like for the first time ever someone had seen all of her. He didn't see the beautiful seductress whom the world of men wanted her to be. When she had first become immortal, she had tried to dress as she had in life, but none of the humans took her seriously. She could lay bare a whole city and they would still shake their heads in disbelief that this poor little country girl had power. She had learned to become a presence they feared by being something from their fantasies. Now when she walked into a room, everyone stopped. Men wanted to possess her and women wanted to be like her. She was the epitome of beauty and seemed unattainable. Simon saw none of this. Instead, he had taken the time to get to know her. For that, she would be eternally grateful. The gods chose wisely with you, Simon. I believe you have a good soul, she told him, still looking over the city and not wanting to see his reaction to her first words of kindness since her own death. So do you, Taya. I think you may have just forgotten, he answered quietly. She turned to look at him and wondered if perhaps he might be right. They spent the rest of the night talking of his plans about what he should do with the humans. When the family had gathered for breakfast the next morning, they were surprised when two strangers came walking through one of the doors. Sawyer could see it was an immortal door by the sheer size of it. She noticed this one had ornate designs of oceans and waterfalls. Aiden stood up so fast when they entered his chair tipped over backward, and he rushed towards the duo. He picked up the male first and spun him around in a friendly big hug. Then he grabbed the woman and did the same thing to her. He was obviously excited to see them, and everyone wondered who they were. They both laughed at the greeting. It was clear they were used to the way Aiden greeted people. The female laughed as she yelled at him playfully, "Put me down, you giant child." He planted her gently back down on the floor. Aiden turned and threw his arms around both of their shoulders, drawing them in against him. He faced the crowd with them, grinning like a maniac. "Come and meet our newest brother," he said, and Simon stood up to greet them. "Simon, meet the other natural-born immortals. This handsome devil on my right is Pan, and this fetching beauty is Nyx." He introduced them with enthusiasm, and Simon extended his hand to them. "It's nice to meet you both," Simon told them after shaking their hands. "May I introduce my family?" he asked, and turned to where they sat together. After Simon had introduced them, Pan wasted no time making his way to Sawyer. Sawyer noticed his delicate features and pointed ears right away. He had long hair that was intricately braided, and his pale blue eyes were highlighted by his pale skin. She remembered how Mother would tuck her into bed at night and tell her the tales of the Elfin King Pan. She told of the beautiful kingdom he had lived in high atop a waterfall. Sawyer would become lost in the details of the stories, as Mother's described in great detail the people of his kingdom. Sawyer would always fall asleep during the telling of them. She understood now that Mother had not been telling her a bedtime story, but in fact something of her own history with these people. Pan came and crouched down in front of Sawyer so he was eye level, and his braid hung over his shoulder. He looked at her and marveled at what he saw before him. "What a magnificent beauty you are," he said in an amazed tone, still looking at her every feature as if he were trying to recognize something in her. "You look exactly like the Elfin King Mother used to describe to me when she would tell me bedtime stories," Sawyer said in awe, looking over his every feature just as intently. "Who is your mother?" Pan asked curiously. "I speak of the mother of all faith," Sawyer answered, tilting her head, wondering if he might know her. "Is that her name now? I have often wondered what she would choose as her name," he said, and stood up and took the chair across from her. He scooted it close to Sawyer so they could talk. "You know Mother?" Sawyer asked, confused at how she had never known the elf had really existed and wasn't just a fairy tale. "Yes. Did you think she made me up?" he asked, amused. She laughed a little and said, "I actually did. She is the creator of fairy tales, but now I see her imagination might not be as vast as I thought it was, she answered. She did love to make up stories to tell in the quiet of the evenings, he told her, remembering the stories she would string together as they looked up at the stars. What was her name before she became Mother? Asked Sawyer, fascinated to learn that Mother, before any of them had existed. It was well known she was the first Fae, but she spoke so little of the time before she gave birth for the first time. I simply called her White Bird. She loved the color of the doves, and we would spend hours chasing them to see where they would go, he explained, letting himself be carried off into memory for a moment. When did you know her? Asked Sawyer. When she was first created, and then all alone, Gaia sent her to me to her. The elfin people had been created for the species of humans before the one you know now. When we failed to save them, Gaia created your mother, he told her. So if you failed, what happened to your people? Asked Sawyer. We were sent to another realm so that they could save the new humans, he answered. Tell me of Mother when she was young, Sawyer asked almost wistfully. Better yet, let me show you, Pan said, and his memory was waved in for them all to see. Mother stood in front of them as a young woman. Gone was her white hair of age, and in front of them she stood in youth. Sawyer was mesmerized by the whole scene. Mother was running through the forest, dodging in and out of trees. She was laughing, and Pan was trying to catch up to her. She ran barefoot in a white dress made of deerskin that was encased in glass now, the first Fey dress. Her hair flowed around her waist, and she smiled in a way that Sawyer had never seen. She smiled with the innocence of life, yet untouched by the humans. She finally collapsed on a bed of thick moss, and Pan collapsed beside her. She continued to giggle long after the chase was over, and pointed at the doves flying overhead. When their hands reached out for one another, Sawyer understood that they had been in love. That dress she wears is in my home. We keep all of the Fae's dresses, and this is the first she kept, Sawyer told them. I'm glad to hear that. I made this dress for her when she was first created. I often wondered if this was why she loved the color white so much, Pan said, musing on the idea. You loved her? Asked Sawyer. Yes, and she loved me, Pan answered with a touch of sadness. Why didn't you stay with her then? Asked Sawyer. The gods eventually ordered me away from her. All of the others had left the realm, and I remained behind with her. Her whole reason for creation was being ruined because of me. She was meant to have children by man so the bloodlines could mix and help save them. She could not do that if she was in love with me, he said, and remembered the terrible day when Gaia had come to them both and told them what must have happened. They had been together for 300 years, and the news had broken both of their hearts. She had wept while he held her tightly. Their goodbye had been the worst day either had ever lived and would ever live. Is she well? Asked Pan curiously. Yes, she lives in the Fey realm now, although she looks different from what you remember, Sawyer answered. Show me, please, he asked her, and she noted the tone of excitement in his voice at seeing her again. Sawyer waved in her own memory of Mother. She was walking through the forest in the Fey realm, her long white hair in a braid, and the gait of her walk slowed by age. She is exactly how I remember her, Pan exclaimed. She's a little bit older, though, Sawyer said, realizing how excited he must be not to notice how much she's aged. Pan turned to look at Sawyer for a moment before looking back at Mother. I see she has gained wisdom, but look at her feet as she dips her toe in the deep moss. She lovingly reaches out and touches the tree in greeting. To you she may look different from my own memory of her, but I see nothing has changed. Look again at her young Fae, and you will see her essence is the same, only her body has changed with the passing of time, Pan told her and watched Mother once again with a look of longing. Sawyer looked at Mother now with fresh eyes, and she did indeed notice all the little things he had pointed out. She had never thought of Mother in the way she had once been, only what she was now. She was amazed at how the woman she thought she had known had many layers Sawyer never bothered to look at. She promised herself when she got home she would get to know Mother in a different way. Sawyer turned to Pan. Why don't you visit her now? She no longer is obligated to the humans, and her realm will be a wonderful place for you to rekindle your friendship, Sawyer suggested. Pan looked at her in surprise at the idea. You're right. When this is all over, I shall travel to see my white bird, he said. Sawyer looked at him confused. "Then what is all over?" she asked. He simply looked at her with a blank expression and wouldn't answer. Nix, who had gone to sit by Taya, broke the awkward silence of Pan when it became clear he would not provide the answer. "So the gods have called upon you already," Nix said to Simon. Simon looked at her. She had the longest hair he had ever seen, and she was very tall. He thought her voice was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard when she spoke. It was soothing him somehow, and yet he couldn't remember being upset before. He continued to stare at her, hoping she would speak again. Taya leaned over to him and snapped her fingers right in front of his face. He was startled, like he had been awoken abruptly from a dream. "Nyx is a siren. You will become used to her voice, and it will not affect you any more," Taya told him, slightly amused. "A siren?" he said, confused. "Yes. We were created long ago for the humans. We were meant to soothe them. The gods thought perhaps if they could remain calm, they could be controlled. Unfortunately, the sound of our voices made them forget everything else. They couldn't eat or sleep. They just sat and waited us to sing or speak. We were like a drug to them, and when we refused to sing any more, the entire species went mad, and the violence of that age was unmatched by anything before or since then. That species was very short-lived, as the humans have no ability to learn how to get used to our voices," Nick explained, and Sawyer was beginning to wonder if all of Mother's fairy tales were indeed true. Simon did not answer, only stared at Nix again. Taya snapped her fingers again, and he startled awake. He had heard everything she said, but he could not respond, only listen. He understood what a dangerous thing the sirens had really been. Taya looked around the room and saw everyone else was staring at Nix now. She looked at Ra and Aiden and said, "Well, what are you waiting for? Start snapping them out of it," she ordered. It took 2 hours for them to all become immune to her voice. She simply sang a song, and then they would be awoken from their daze until finally everyone was immune to the sound of her voice. Afterwards, Simon met privately with the Immortals while the others found ways to occupy themselves. When he finished, Simon walked with Cassia and his mom through the courtyard. Cassia was describing to them both exactly what she wanted it to look like for her wedding. Sawyer would be in charge of flowers, and Simon could arrange everything exactly how she wanted as long as he could picture it in his mind. He knew he faced many challenges ahead of him and had the responsibility of the fate of the human race in his hands. He also knew his family was just as important and that Cassia deserved the same care and attention she had always given to him. As Taya came walking towards them, though, Simon found it hard to concentrate on Cassia's words. He knew Taya was beautiful, but today, somehow, it felt like he was seeing her for the first time. She walked in her slow gait towards them. She was wearing a strip of cloth that hung dangerously low on her hips and was only covering her front and back. It was secured by a band of cloth wrapped around it, and the same band crisscrossed around her chest and tied behind her neck. The cloth of her makeshift dress swayed from side to side with her hips as she walked towards them. His eyes took in the beauty of her. Cassia was talking about wanting Freesia to drape down so the night air could be filled with the snow when Taya finally walked up. Taya was intrigued by the powers the Fae had. "Simon, can you also make flowers grow?" she asked, curious as to what Fae powers he had. He laughed at the question. "The Fae spent so many hours teaching me that if I couldn't, I might be exiled from the Fae realm," he told her, remembering all the hours and frustration he had with that particular lesson. He and Paul had only learned the rudimentary skills needed when it came to flowers. "Hannah and Harlow are much better at it than me, but my mom is by far the best. Come, I will show you," he said, and grabbed her hand without thinking, and pulled her with him to a nearby flower. "Do you see the tiny silver string connected to it, almost like a wisp of smoke? It's so small and translucent," he asked, leaning down with her to peer. She squinted her eyes and stared for a minute. "No, I see nothing," she finally admitted. "May I lift your veil?" he asked. "My what?" she asked, confused. "Your veil. It keeps you from seeing the energy that connects all life," he answered and waved his hand in front of her face. Suddenly the whole courtyard was alive with the silver strings. Only the Fae were created to see it. But this is where we draw our power from. This is what the daughters of Seraphim can feel but never see, he told her as she looked around, astonished at how everything was connected to it. "What is it, though?" she asked. Simon turned to Sawyer, knowing she was much better at explaining it than he could ever be. She not only explained the science of it, but still held the wonderment of it in her voice when she spoke about it. It is the ethereal energy that connects all living things. It connects us not only here, but also in this very realm to every star in the sky. Think of it as an intricate spider web, and we are all caught in it. Some of us are more connected than others, and yet we remain connected to everything. It was what the Fae tried to teach the humans when Mother was first created. Let your finger reach out and gently touch the string from the flower and feel its vibration, Sawyer instructed her. Taya reached out her fingertip tentatively towards the small silver string on the tiny flower. She was amazed when she felt a small buzzing coming from it. I can feel it, she said excitedly. Simon reached out to touch it also and closed his eyes for a moment to concentrate. He hadn't done this in a very long time and didn't want to blow it in front of Taya. Slowly, Taya could feel the buzzing grow stronger, and the tiny flower began to grow in front of her eyes as Simon manipulated its energy. Taya watched as the string reached out to a nearby bee and touched it. They connected, and the bee flew over and began to drink the sweet nectar from the flower. She stood up and told Simon, "That's really amazing. If I were a fae, I would be surrounded by flowers all the time," she said, and he could see some of her personality shining through. He remembered that when she had taken him to her home, she was always picking flowers and stringing them together for her hair as she waited for the prince to come. He smiled broadly at her and said, "You should see the garden at home, or the one in the Fae realm. It would blow your mind what these Fae can grow." Sawyer and Cassia watched the two of them explore the silver string together and talk. Sawyer noticed the marked change in Taya when Simon was around. The young woman would display emotion, and Sawyer saw she even laughed once. She also noticed Simon around her. He was so careful and gentle when he dealt with her. Cassia, who was standing beside her, watched them also. "Do you think they know yet?" she asked. "Know what?" Sawyer asked, turning at her confused. Cassia smiled. "They're falling in love," she answered. Sawyer turned back to the duel, and she finally saw what Cassia was talking about. Aiden found Hannah sitting with Harlow, sketching dress ideas for the wedding. Harlow was better at design, but Hannah was better at sketching her ideas. They had their heads close together, and Harlow would suggest a change, and Hannah would begin erasing in that spot. Aiden leaned down over the top of them to see what they were drawing. He watched quietly for a minute, but Aiden was incapable of being ignored for long. "You can't make a dress without fabric," he told them seriously. Hannah looked up at him and smiled at him. "I know. We're going to see what we can scrounge up later. I'm sure this place is full of fabric," she answered back seriously, but she knew he would have a different suggestion. "Or we can go to the market, and you can pick out exactly what you want," he said hopefully and grinned. "I don't know," Hannah said, knowing she loved the idea, but wanting Aiden to sell her on it. "I think that's a brilliant idea," Harlow said enthusiastically. "We've been cooped up here for days. We're definitely going." "I've been out," Hannah told her in a matter-of-fact tone. "When?" Harlow asked. "Aiden took me to ride camels," Hannah told her twin nonchalantly and shrugged like it was no big deal. "Well, that sounds absolutely awful," Harlow said and stood up. "I'm going to see if Liam wants to come. Wait for me," she said as she breezed out of the room, the decision already made. Hannah looked up at Aiden and said, "Well, I guess we're going," trying to sound annoyed when she really wasn't. Aiden grinned like a fool and jumped over the seat and landed where Harlow had been sitting. He looked at Hannah excitedly and said, "You're going to love it." Hannah couldn't help but laugh at his antics. He was always so excited to do such mundane things. She knew going to the market with him would be fun. He made everything seem like an adventure. She did, in fact, love it. The stalls and tables in the shopping corridors were filled with exotic items. The whole street was alive with colors and smells. Foods were being cooked out in the open to be sold. Fabrics of multiple textures and colors hung down to be picked through. Bowls, cookware, spices, and jewelry lined tables everywhere. Both of the girls had been instantly excited to see everything laid out before them and could hardly contain their glee. Ra had given them purses stuffed with the currency of the time and made them promise to stay close to Aiden and Liam. The market could be dangerous for young girls, he had warned. Harlow had kissed the Immortal on the cheek when she reached for her money and said, "Thanks, Dad," before taking it. Ra had laughed, remembering these girls were all so powerful and could take care of themselves. Harlow and Liam had wandered off a while ago, and Hannah looked at the faces of people who had lived so long ago. Their names and faces had been lost to memory, and she tried to hold on to as many faces as she could in her mind. Aidan spent the day showering her with gifts, and the servants who followed behind them had their arms loaded down. She loved it, and realized she had never enjoyed shopping this much before, although Aidan seemed to make everything more fun. His good mood was infectious. He showed her what foods to try and what foods to avoid. She was so caught up trying to look at everything that she hadn't noticed when they had come to the outer edge of the market. This place had a rougher looking crowd and seemed dangerous when she finally noticed. Men were leering at her, and even the servants had become uncomfortable. Aiden, I think we should turn back, she said quietly, looking around warily. We're almost there, he said confidently. Almost where? She asked, confused at where they could be going. He stopped in front of an old man who sat on a dirty, tattered mat. He looked up at them, and Hannah could see his eyes were milky white with cataracts. On the mat in front of him sat crudely made bracelets on a dirty cloth. Hannah's heart instantly went out to him, and she crouched down to speak. What beautiful bracelets, she told him, knowing she would only look like a shadow to him with his vision being so poor. The old man's smile lit up when she said it. I make them myself, he explained, liking the kindness in her voice. It had been so long since anyone had shown him kindness. Well, I must buy for everyone in my family. It's my aunt's wedding, and she has no jewelry to wear. I'm afraid I will have to buy them all, she told him, and scooped them all up. She placed the heavy bag of coin from Ra in his hands. I'm afraid this is all I have, though, she said. He felt the weight of the bag and placed a hand inside of it. He felt the size and weight of the coins and knew instantly she had given him gold pieces. Daughter, this is too much to pay, he said, worried about the thieves he knew who would be standing around watching them. Nonsense. For bracelets that are this beautiful, I should pay twice this. You're being kind selling it to me for so cheap, she told him. He clasped her hands in his and leaned forward. When my eyes could still see, I was the finest jeweler in the land. I was once the royal jeweler, and made all of the jewelry for the king and queen. You do an old man a kindness today, daughter, and I will never forget it, he told her. You do me a kindness by letting me share your treasures with my family, she told him, and helped him to get to his feet. She had the servants help him roll his mat and told them quietly they would see him home. All the food and things that had been bought today would be left with him after they had seen him home safely. She watched as he walked slowly away with the servants. She turned to Aidan. Thank you for bringing me here, she said. He looked down at her, his usual smile replaced with something else, a seriousness she had never seen in him before. I'm glad you see beauty in the same things I do. He once was so talented, and Tay and Ross still wear his pieces. Even when he was the best in the land, he was a kind man. You have brought him happiness today with your kindness, he told her, watching the old man walk away. She slipped on one of the crude bracelets and knew she would treasure it always. Harlow had run ahead of Liam when she spotted a tiny monkey tied to a post with a thin rope. When Liam had finally caught up to her, she was already bartering over the price. It had already hopped onto her shoulder while she had one of the servants translate for her. She was trying to calm it down while yelling angrily at the shopkeeper. Finally, her price was agreed upon, and the end of the rope was handed to her. She immediately untied it from the monkey's neck and threw it back at the shopkeeper. Liam stood ready to intervene because it looked like things were going badly very quickly. He looked around, judging how many of them he would have to kill. Harlow just walked away, though, and everyone went back to their business. Liam let out a sigh of relief. He wasn't sure how the Immortals would react if he killed anyone in their marketplace, although for Harlow he was willing to take his chances. She headed towards him, a frustrated look on her face. When she finally reached him, he looked at her monkey and said, You felt like you needed a new pet today, he asked, amused by her sour face. She looked at the monkey for a second, and he swore they both shook their heads at him in exasperation. No, I did not feel like buying a pet. I bought her so I could set her free. She hated that mean old ugly man who kept her tied up, Harlow explained, and then gave one of the servants a couple of coins and pointed to a table selling fruit. Liam had forgotten she could communicate with animals and smiled a rare smile at her that lit up his eyes. You're cute, he said. Harlow blushed when he said it and stammered a reply. We need to go, she said, frustrated at her own awkwardness with him. She was used to being in control of herself, especially around guys. Why did he make her feel like she was never standing on solid ground when he was around? She could swear she now understood what it meant to swoon. He grabbed her free hand and said, "Come on, let's go set your monkey free." And she just giggled. When the four of them walked back in that evening, Sawyer looked at her daughters in surprise. Hannah's servants carried armloads of packages because Aiden had insisted on rebuying everything she had given away as they walked back out of the market. Harlow had nothing but a wide-eyed look of happiness. Usually it was the opposite when the girls went shopping. Hannah would have just a couple things while Harlow needed an extra car to bring back everything she had bought. Sawyer raised her eyebrows at the girls. "Harlow, why didn't you buy anything?" "I bought a monkey, but then we set it free," Harlow said wistfully. "Is that all you bought? You've been gone for hours," Sawyer asked her. "Liam and I were near the Sphinx when we set the monkey free, so we spent the afternoon looking at it and exploring near it. I believe they've started building a pyramid," she said offhandedly. Sawyer swung her gaze to Hannah now. "Did you buy all of that stuff?" she asked unbelievingly. "I did. Well, Aiden bought it for me because I gave all my money away to a sweet old man. Look at this bracelet I got, though. It's my favorite, and I got one for all of you guys, too," she said, and held up her wrist. Sawyer looked at the crude bracelet that looked as if a child had crafted it from scraps of copper no one wanted. Sawyer saw Hannah was beaming with pride at it, and so she forced a smile. "It's lovely," said Sawyer, wondering what was going on with her daughters. Hannah turned her wrist around so she could admire the bracelet again and stare at it like she was mesmerized. "Isn't it, though?" she said, not looking away from it. Sawyer would have to talk to both of them later. She was starting to understand the change in Harlow as she saw her daughter falling in love with Liam. Hannah, though, had a complete personality change. She was no longer interested in being perfect and wanting everyone to like her. She was expressing herself in a way that Sawyer had never seen and honestly didn't understand. She wanted Hannah to be happy, but wasn't sure if she was seeing the real girl. Either Hannah had been hiding these parts of herself her whole life, or she was exploring things she had always wanted to try. She wanted her to be happy and feel supported, but she wasn't sure how to do that anymore. She looked at her daughters, hoping she could keep up with all the changes happening. Marcus and Paul had gone to inspect the Sphinx earlier and had run into Harlow and Liam for a while. The Sphinx was just being finished in its detailing and was brand new. The builders had gladly shown them both around and explained to them exactly why it had been built. No one in history had ever uncovered the reason behind one of the greatest icons in Egypt's history. When Marcus and Simon had been told, they both laughed, knowing no one would ever believe if they ever tried to add the explanation to the history books. They spent hours questioning the builders of the first pyramid being built. They were also a mystery and speculation around the pyramids, but they both decided that information would remain just between the two of them. Before they left the palace that morning, Marcus had gone to Taya with a request, and he wondered now if he was being considered. He hoped for Paul's sake it was. Sawyer walked with Julius, watching the sunset. She was feeling like life was moving so quickly here. So many changes were happening all at once, and she was feeling overwhelmed. Truth be told, she was starting to feel like she was losing her children. She wasn't ready to let go of them, as she kept the image of them in her mind as babies still. She knew they were adults and were going to have all their own lives, but she didn't think it would happen this soon. She needed the calming presence of her husband. Julius, of course, noticed the unusual silence as they walked. "Are you going to tell me what's wrong, or will you make me guess?" he asked gently. She looked up into his eyes, those eyes that had always held her heart firmly in its grip. "It's the children. I feel like they are all changing so fast. I don't know who they are anymore," she said solemnly. He laughed at this. "Sawyer, they are the same people they always were, but their lives must become bigger than the two of us. Do you remember what your life was before I met you? What it was like before we had children? You want to protect them and keep them safe as if they're all still babies, and I assure you they are not," he told her. She thought about it for a moment. It seemed as if she had been waiting in limbo before Julius had shown up on her doorstep. She had friends and her Faye family, but he was her missing part. Everything since him had been magical and wonderful. She had felt whole once she had met him, and wondered if this is how her own children felt now. She wondered if this feeling had made Hannah close her eyes to the truth of Derek, because she wanted to feel whole. She hated the thought of any of them feeling like this. "What about Simon, though?" she asked Julius, knowing that was a very real issue. "He seems so distant since returning from the gods," she said. Simon hasn't told me what happened yet, but you're right. He is distant now. I can see whatever they told him weighs on him heavily, but I know he will come to us when he is ready. Just because he is immortal doesn't mean he will forget he has a family, Sawyer, he told her and wrapped his arms around her. She let her head rest on his shoulder and said, I can't protect him if I don't know what's wrong, she said desperately. He pulled her in front of him so he could look her in the eyes when he spoke. When you had your own powers sung in, you said you saw your children saving everything. Do you remember that? He asked. She nodded. Yes, of course. Your children are powerful, Sawyer. You are not meant to protect them, but rather stand beside them as we all fight. We have done our job well. Now stand aside and let them become who they are meant to be, he counseled gently. She let herself be wrapped back in his arms and found solace in its touch and scent. She knew he was right, and now the time was soon to be upon them to fight. She had felt it in her own energy as she reached out to Simon when his own powers were supposed to be sung in. She had seen them standing together and fighting in a world that was on fire. The planet was burning as they raced to save it. She had seen only a glimpse, but it had been enough. The time had come for all of them to become who they were meant to be. Sawyer and Julius walked into the dining room just as dinner was being served. Everyone looked up when they walked in, and Sawyer wondered what they had been discussing. The nervous look on all her children's faces told her she wasn't going to like it, whatever it was. After they sat down and had been served, Taya spoke. Now that everyone is here, I would like to invite you all to join us in the battle tonight, she offered as though she were offering more wine. What battle? Asked Julius, ever ready as a soldier. The troll war, answered Ra, looking embarrassed. Aren't the trolls what you sired, Ra? I thought they were all killed off, asked Sawyer. They will be tonight, he answered cryptically. Ra and I live in a time loop here. For 40 decades we ruled over this kingdom, and it was on this night that we eradicated the trolls. The dreadful things will attack the city tonight, and we will fight until they are all dead. In the morning Ra will leave to their nest in the desert and finish them off, Taya said, as if the time loop were normal. Time loop? Asked Simon. Time loop, yes. The same 40 years over and over again. Our people began to grow scared of our never-changing appearance. We had to think of a way to let someone else take the throne. We come back and live here for the same 40 years. Tonight is the last night, and when the sun rises in the morning, the time will start over. Most of the servants you have grown used to seeing will not have been born yet, and the palace will be filled with the people from 40 years ago. We ended the loop after the troll war, Jay explained. How did you make a time loop? Asked Simon curiously. We thought of it, Immortal, the same way that someday you will wish to go back to a time and make your own loop. As immortals, we merely have to think of something for it to manifest. All immortals have them, and when you are old enough, you will make one also, Ross said as if he were speaking to a child. Tonight the trolls will attack, and we will go and destroy them. This is the night that our reign will end, and tomorrow the people of this land will think that we were lost in a great battle. Tomorrow will merely start the loop again for us. But we have seen what happened after the Troll War, and to this great empire after we were gone, Taya said. It is why we are here, explained Nyx. Yes, we have come, and we fight in the Troll War every time the loop comes around, Pan said nonchalantly. Sometimes you need a bloody battle to get the blood flowing again, Dagon said, excited for the upcoming event. My children have never been in any kind of battle before, Sawyer said, shocked that they would even be asking this of her families. Exactly why they should fight tonight, Aiden said, confused as to why Sawyer would be worried about her children fighting. I agree, they must start somewhere learning how to fight, and what better time than the Troll War, said Pan, also confused by Sawyer's hesitation. I will not see them hurt, or worse yet, killed by trolls, Sawyer protested. All the immortals started laughing at this, which only made Sawyer angrier. I have watched your sons practice swords with his father. He will be fine. Besides, your children are supernatural and have nothing to fear, Dagon said, amused by her protest. Sawyer turned to Julius for support and was horrified by the look he was giving Marcus. They were both silently contemplating it. No harm will come to your children. We will protect them if we must, but I think you will see they will be fine. This battle has already been fought, and the outcome will not change. There is no harm in them learning to fight this way, Taya said, hoping she was placating Sawyer. Sawyer was about to speak again against the idea once more, but Paul spoke up first. I'm in. I would finally like to use the skills Father and Marcus have been teaching me all these years, he said, like he was agreeing so he could do research on his own fighting skills. Simon grinned at his brother who sat next to him and clapped him on the back. We will finally fight side by side with the men who taught us to fight, he said excitedly. Harlow and I will fight also. It's about time we learned how to use our powers for something else besides growing flowers, Hannah said, volunteering her twin without asking her. Harlow, to her credit, squeezed her sister's arm and nodded at her in agreement. Excellent. It's time for you girls to feel the strength of your own power. Once you've felt it, you'll never be the same, Nix told the twins, grinning at them. Sawyer felt like she had lost control of the situation quickly. Her daughters couldn't possibly fight. Cassia sighed heavily, not willing to let her nieces fight without her, and realized they weren't going to be swayed. Then we will all fight, she told them. They all looked toward Sawyer now. Sawyer, Julius said, waiting for her to agree. Sawyer took a deep breath and exhaled her anger at being blindsided by the situation. She tried to tamp down the rage that was building inside of her before she spoke. How can I refuse? She answered, and everyone heard the anger in her voice despite her efforts to quell it. They come after midnight, and we will wait for the bells to begin ringing to signal us. We will go to the war room after dinner and ready ourselves, Dagon said with excitement. The room buzzed with excitement as they hurried to finish their meals. Sawyer's head began ticking like a time bomb. The war room was merely a huge cavern underneath the palace that opened to the city by two enormous doors. If soldiers were being called, horses could ride in and out of the room, and makeshift beds were stacked in the far corner for the wounded. It was dark inside, and the torches they carried were the only light to see by. As they descended the narrow, winding stairs, Sawyer felt the darkness reaching out to her. It took everything she had not to reach back for it. When they entered the room, Taya placed a torch by a large copper sheet, and it reflected the light to another copper sheet. The whole room was lit up when all the sheets finally reflected off one another. The walls were lined with a variety of weapons and uniforms. Everything was dusty and old, like they hadn't been touched in years. Marcus pulled down a sword and blew the dust from it. Are you sure these weapons will hold? They look corrupted, he said, examining it. They will hold, Aiden replied as he began to choose from among the weapons. When was your last battle? Julius asked, examining his shield. Our last war was 39 years ago, Ra and I maintained peace when we reigned, Taya told them, pulling down a leather skirt. How do you maintain a time loop? Simon asked curiously. Most realms, when they are created, are as big as a planet. When we create a time loop, we create a realm that is the size of a room, and in it we contain the circle of time we choose. This loop will exist as long as the realm for it exists, Tay explained. What happens when you decide you don't want it anymore? Simon asked her. Then time simply returns to its original place. It does not stop existing just because we loop it like this. This is more like a copy than the original. We just pulled it from the original timeline, but did not take it away. Time will not allow that to happen, Ra explained. We all have them, a time when we were most happy. Someday we'll make one of your own, Aiden told him. You have your own loop like this? Hannah asked Aiden, curious to see what it would be like. Aiden nodded at her seriously and said, I do, and perhaps I will take you there someday. My parents and family still exist in my loop. They would love to see a fae, he said and smiled at her. Hannah blushed and he handed her two forked daggers, bringing her back to the reality of what they were about to do. Sawyer was looking at the uniforms, not really paying attention. The darkness was thick in the room and she could feel it slowly seeping into her as she thought of her children. She did not notice when Dagon approached her. You choose no weapon, Faye? He asked and leaned against the wall seductively. She noticed his shirt was unbuttoned as usual and wondered if he would remember how to button them. I need no weapon, Immortal, she answered icily, letting the dark energy change the sound of her voice. He continued to lean against the wall, but noted the change happening to her. He had never given much attention to the Fae. They were too sweet for his taste. The Furies had been fun to watch, though, and he was certain he was beginning to see some of their darkness come out in this one. He made a mental note to watch her during the battle, and pushed himself up from the wall with his shoulders. I look forward to seeing you fight, Faye, he said, and walked off. She watched him walk off and run his hands over blades until he found one he liked. When she looked up at her family, she could see they had changed into soldiers' uniforms. They were made of linen and hardened leather, and each one of them had their weapons held ready. When the bells began to sound, she felt the darkness rush into her quickly, and she welcomed it this time. She put her arms in front of her and pointed her hands down towards the ground. The dark energy flowed into her welcoming arms, and her transformation began. They all watched in amazement at Sawyer's transformation. The wind began to blow around her, and her hair turned raven black, as did her clothing. Her head began to fill with rage and the desire to protect only those she loved. Aiden opened the doors to the outside, and they all made their way out. No one noticed Paul when they watched Sawyer, and no one noticed him now until he was outside. Paul had also been filled by the dark energy and was transformed like his mother, his hair black and clothing black like hers. He had a wild look in his eyes, and he felt a rage he had never known before. The wind whipped around mother and son now, and they ran into the night, killing anything that crossed their paths. That night was filled with the screams of the people who had only a few minutes before been sleeping in their beds. The guttural grunts of the trolls were terrifying, and the sight of them could freeze the blood in your veins. They were as tall as 2 men, and they had enormous beak-like noses. They were well muscled, and there were thousands of them swarming the city like cockroaches. They hadn't caught sight of the group yet as they walked out of the war room, but Sawyer and Paul, who had already run ahead, were already in the fray. Aiden looked at Hannah. "Stay by my side. Do not leave it, no matter what happens," he instructed. And gone was the sweet, good-natured man, and in his place stood a fierce warrior. Hannah nodded her understanding and felt the first rush of adrenaline flow through her body. Liam grabbed Harlow's hand and said, "You're with me." She gripped his hand tightly and said, "Always." Aiden turned to the group before rushing off with Hannah and said, "You must take off their heads or they will not die," and then rushed into the night with Hannah. The storm was raging around Sawyer as she took off their heads one by one. With each death, the dark energy grew stronger, and she wanted more. Simon was fighting next to Julius and was amazed that every stroke his father had taught him was proving to be lethal. He watched his father and uncle in amazement and wondered if they had been terrified on the battlefield before the change. He finally understood what the years of training had taught him. He turned just in time to see a troll going for Taya's back as she fought another one. He knew she was distracted, and all he could think of was he had to save her. He had reached her just as the troll raised a club above his head to strike her down. He lunged for her, and they rolled over. She looked over to see the blow meant for her head as it landed in the sand beside her. Dagon had come by just then and lopped off the troll's head, and it landed next to them, staring out of one eye. Taya realized Simon had meant to save her life. She stood up and offered her hand to help him get back on his feet. She planted a shy kiss on his cheek before she turned and began fighting again. Simon stood stunned until a troll knocked him across the sand with a blow from his club. Simon snapped back to the reality of where they were and began to fight again. Aiden stood atop a pile of rubble and fought the trolls while Hannah stood nearby, trying her best to fight the smaller ones. It was during this battle she realized she was not meant to be a killer and hoped her future did not depend on her fighting skills. As they were backed up, she realized they were near the Sphinx now, and a large one came charging at her. She ducked just as the beast swung, and it ended up knocking the nose off a newly erected statue. Aiden, seeing her in danger, jumped on the troll's back before it could once again swing at her, and riding it like a bucking horse, chopped its head off. When the creature fell to the ground, Aiden picked Hannah up from the ground. He wordlessly checked her to make sure she had no injuries, and then stood tall in front of her. He did not move from this position until the battle had ended. He had kept her safely behind him the whole time. Harlow found that when he was fighting, Liam was ruthless and would toy with his opponent until he tired of it and killed it. Harlow had tried swinging his sword and had only cut one of the trolls and watched in horror as it began to bleed out of its neck. Liam turned to find her trying to help and swung his blade quickly. He knew full well the troll would not have the same mercy for her. She looked at him, understanding she could not survive this night without him, and stayed close to him, never losing sight of him. After what had seemed like hours, the last troll fell. Sawyer could hear Julius's voice from far away. She began to concentrate on the sound of it, and it seemed to be coming closer. Finally, she was looking into his eyes and could hear his voice in front of her. "Come back to me," he said, and the fog of darkness lifted from her brain. She grasped his face and looked and said, "I'm here," and he pulled her into his arms. Then she remembered Paul and frantically looked around for him. He was standing next to her and he was fine. "How?" she asked him. Paul just looked at her and shrugged. not exactly knowing. I just decided to change back when the fighting was over, he told her. You can control the dark energy, she asked, stunned. Yes, or at least I think I can. When it came to me, I accepted the use of it, and when I was done, it left when I wished it to, he told her, not really sure how he had commanded it. She was going to ask him more questions, but a blood-soaked Dagon came walking up like a lion after it had killed its prey. His white shirt was now red, and his naked chest and face was covered in blood. Sawyer understood now why his sires were cursed with bloodlust. They surveyed the destruction all around them, and the headless corpses of the dead trolls. They saw Ra walking far ahead in the distance, going towards the rising sun. What is he doing? Simon asked Taya. He is going to finish them off. A few are left in their nest. The trolls will no longer exist after today, she explained. Watch now as Ra becomes a god to these people, the last image of him they will have when he is walking into the rising sun. He will turn in a moment to look at them, but only one eye will be visible to them. Then the sun will blind them as it crests above the sand. It will seem as if he has disappeared in the sunlight, with one eye watching over them, and his legend will be born in this moment. Aiden said to them as he watched. In all his centuries, this moment had never grown old to him, the day an immortal became a god. Ra turned to look at them. His long hair had fallen down over half of his face during the fighting. As the sun rose further, the first rays of sun shone into their eyes, and they had to shield their eyes from its brightness. When they looked up, he was gone, and the legend of the sun god Ra was born. It was a historic moment to witness. They returned now to the palace and waited for Ra to return. Sawyer noticed right away the servants all looked different. Taya noticed all their discomfort at the sight of the little changes around them. The time loop has been reset with the rising sun. We are at the beginning now, she reminded them. They all cleaned up and met for breakfast. As they waited to be served, a young man was shown into the room. Put what you have on the table so we may see it, Taya instructed the young man. Hannah looked at the young man and thought he looked vaguely familiar. She furrowed her brows, trying to place him in her memories. He began to unravel his cloth and laid out beautifully intricate jewelry pieces for her to admire. Taya walked over to look, and Ra entered the room, looking clean and refreshed, as if he hadn't just fought trolls all night. He too walked over to see what pieces he had looked at 1,000 times before, when this day happened again and again. As the young man waited for the king and queen to inspect his jewelry, he looked around and noticed the bracelet that Hannah wore. He approached her shyly, not wanting to disturb the queen, and asked her quietly, "May I?" He pointed to the bracelet. Hannah removed the bracelet from her wrist and handed it to him, still not placing him. He twirled it around, looking at it closely. "This looks like the bracelets I made when I first started my apprenticeship as a child. See this mark here," he said, and pointed at the inside of the bracelet, where a small symbol had been hammered into the metal. "This is my mark. All jewelers stamp their work with them, and this one is mine. I make it out of habit now, but when I was learning I would be cuffed on the back of my head because I'd forgotten so often," he said, reliving the memory, and grabbed a piece of cloth he had laid on the table. He held it up to show her the beautiful jewel-encrusted bracelet, held the same symbol as the old copper one she wore. "I could make this mark with my eyes closed," he told her. It was then that she realized where she knew him from. He was the old man in the market yesterday, the old man whose sight had failed him, and yet he could still make his mark on jewelry. "Where did you get this? I thought my master had melted down all my practice pieces," he asked, excited to see his own work. Hannah did not have the heart to explain this was a piece he would make in the future. "I found it yesterday in the marketplace. The sweet old man was selling it," she told him. He offered her the new bracelet he held in his hand. "A beauty like you deserves to have something equally as beautiful," he said, bowing. She smiled at him sadly for a moment. "No, thank you. This one has more meaning to me than its beauty," she told him. He smiled at her and was secretly glad that his original piece graced her wrist. "I'm glad to see it so treasured," he said.